and I'm an artist and professor here at UC San Diego, and a longtime partner and co-organizer of this annual Russell Lecture. So for many years, the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego and UC San Diego have partnered on a number of contemporary art programs that benefit the campus and the larger community. Chief amongst these is the annual Russell Lecture. The Russell Foundation was established in 1980 by Betty Russell, a patron of the museum and a longtime supporter of UCSD. And the foundation made art acquisitions for the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego and UCSD. It made student grants available, provided funding for 2 pieces in the Stewart Collection, and a studio addition to the Visual Arts Department, where our beloved Teddy Cruz hides from me. The foundation dissolved in 1994, but the programs it supported live on, including this annual collaboration with the museum and the university that we will enjoy tonight. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Catherine Kanjo, the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego's David C. Copley Director and CEO, who will introduce tonight's esteemed speaker. I'm really excited to listen to June speak, and I hope you'll all go and see her amazing, beautiful mural in downtown La Jolla if you're close by. But before I pass the microphone on to her, I'd like to thank the many generous funders that have made tonight possible, including the Russell Foundation, UC San Diego Department of Visual Arts students and faculty for joining us tonight, Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego members. And if you're not yet a member of the museum, we invite you to consider the benefits, which include enlightening events like tonight, and you can go and look at their fantastic new space, which I must admit I haven't seen yet, but we are very excited to be able to get down there and actually see some art in the flesh, in person again. And institutional support is provided in part by the City of San Diego Commission for the Arts and Culture, and we're grateful to them all. And I'd also like to give a shout out to all of the undergrad students watching tonight, especially those working with Josh Tanias in Biz One and his incredible crew of dynamic and inventive graduate students who are working very closely with you all. I know it's been a really tough week here and you're all freaking out about the midterms, but I'm very excited that you're with us tonight, and I'm curious to hear from you all and read your constructive observations in the chat during the talk. So please, everyone, add your questions to the chat so that we can address them later. We will have a moderated Q&A at the end of June's presentation. Thank you, and Catherine, over to you. Good luck, June.
Thank you. Anya, that's excellent. Thank you. And on behalf of the museum and UCSD's Visual Arts Department, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the 2021 Russell Lecture. And that is June Edmonds. June Edmonds, her abstract canvases are both methodical and metaphorical. Through boldly hued color, repetition, and movement, she generates allusions to the spiritual, political, and bodily. Her recent series present energy circles, flags, and now maps as formats through which to consider race and gender, to commemorate Black positivity, and to celebrate female subjectivity. Los Angeles born and Los Angeles based, June Edmonds did, in fact, receive her BFA down here in San Diego at that other campus, San Diego State University. She studied there and received her BFA, continuing her studies both at Skowhegan in Maine and receiving her MFA at the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. And June has been active for a number of years, decades indeed. But these last few years have really brought renewed attention to June's practice, including with awards. And just this past year, she received the inaugural 2020 AWARE Prize at the Armory. AWARE stands for the Archive of Women Artists Research and Exhibitions. In 2018, she received City of Los Angeles Individual Artist Grant. She has also received California Arts Council Individual Artist Grant. She has also been awarded residencies in very diverse places, the Paducah Artist Residency, which is an interesting one in Kentucky. The Helene Wurlitzer Foundation Artist Residency in Taos, closer to home, the Dorland Mountain Community Residency here in Temecula. June has 2 exhibitions on view at this moment. She has a one-person show at her gallery in Los Angeles, Luis de Jesus. That is on view for just another week through the end of the month. Get there quickly. But then also she's the subject of a 40-year survey, and I did confirm that it's 40 years at the Levan Gallery, which is at Loyola Marymount University. That exhibition is on view into December. So that's a show to see. It's also documented with a catalog with contributions from Jill Moniz and Karen Rapp. She's had June has had other museum exhibitions, including shows at the California African American Museum, the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery, what we refer to as Barnsdale, at the Luckman Fine Art Gallery at Los Angeles State, almost at San Diego, the Watts Tower Art Center, Angels Gate in San Pedro, and more. Anya mentioned that June has a public artwork here as part of Murals of La Jolla, and she has public artworks in Los Angeles as well through the Department of Cultural Affairs, and she has an installation at the MTA Pacific Station, which is in Long Beach. And the mural that's here is on Girard, and the title is Ebony on Draper, but the mural itself is on Girard. And I'm hoping you're going to talk about that a bit. June's paintings are held in a number of museum collections, including the California African American Museum in Los Angeles, the Mead Art Museum, which is at Amherst College, the Davis Museum, which is at Wesley, the David Owsley Museum, which is at Ball State. She's in the Columbus Museum of Art collection as well as several important private collections. But really what we want to do is to hear from June. So at this moment, it is my great pleasure to turn the camera over to June and hear from her. Thank you, June.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you, Anya. It's so amazing to be here. So thank you so much for having me and being such fantastic hosts. I am going to share my screen and share some images with you. So I could just start with that and just talk about sort of my life in work, my art life through the work. And a lot of this artwork is at the Levan Gallery at the 40-year retrospective. So I'm hoping that you could come up for that. It is up until December. So I always loved art, and my mother wasn't an artist, but she loved art as well. So she took us to a few museums and a few art classes. And she took me to a really important show when I was 15 years old, which was 2 centuries of Black American art that was at LACMA. It was sort of the first exhibition at that time. So this is in 1975. And like I said, my mom had taken me to museums before, but I didn't see anything that looked like me or was a reflection of Black life. And so going into that show was sort of the first time that I saw it, so there was representational work, but there was abstract work there as well. Alma Thomas' work was there. Archibald Motley, who is a figurative artist, Charles White, figurative artist, just Henry, William H. Johnson was there, and Jacob Lawrence. So all those artists sort of started getting into my psyche at that point. And at San Diego State, I took a few drawing classes, and then went out to Washington, D.C., and went to many museums and galleries at the Smithsonian, and then really became inspired to be an artist. So when I came back for my third year at San Diego State, I pretty much made the decision to major in art. And that is at the time when these paintings started being created. And when I was at the Smithsonian at the National Gallery, there was a big exhibition of post-impressionist artists. So I saw Van Gogh. It felt like the first time. It couldn't have been the first time, but it felt like the first time that I like really saw these works. Gauguin, Manet. They were huge inspirations for this early work, but also figurative artists. I skipped something. Also figurative artists like that were painting at that time, like Barnett Honeywood, who was an LA artist, and also David Hockney. So you might see some of that in these works. So this is at a studio at San Diego State, or the studio that I painted in, self-portrait. And this is basically my senior year. You know, I wanted to do interiors and just wanted to paint the people around me. And so I've always, you know, enjoyed abstract work. So, you know, just sort of looking back on these, you do see some abstract elements, and it's something that I wanted to at that time sort of figure out how to include and incorporate into my artwork. Now, when I was taking art history at the time, you know, there were no Black artists, brown, any artists of color being discussed at the time at all. And so thanks to my mom for exposing me, you know, to some really great ones. That was a super important show that was in LACMA that I mentioned, called 2 Centuries of Black American Art. You may have heard of it. I knew what names to look for, so I would go in the library at San Diego State and try to find some of these artists. But at that time, there were only like 3 books, you know, that had artwork that had African-American artists, and that was the catalog for the exhibition that I was speaking of at LACMA, and a Romare Bearden book, and maybe a Jacob Lawrence book, and that was it. You know, there were a few books on African art, and I was really interested in that, just interested in the textiles and wanting to incorporate that into the artwork. You know, when I started painting, there were textiles in the artwork, you know, and I always enjoyed doing that. But I thought another way to sort of personalize my interiors were to include some textiles from Africa, and some sculpture as well. You might see some sculpture, African sculpture in some of this work as well. Right. And my brother actually went to UCSD, and this painting is in La Jolla. So we used to meet in La Jolla every now and then, and this was close to the museum there, and just sort of hang out at the beach on occasion. So he went to undergrad there, went to med school there. And so he was there the whole time I was there. So that was nice. And this is another interior. And I have always enjoyed, you know, experimenting with sort of deep space, even within an interior. So including these windows and doors or whatever that have some kind of landscape in them. And so that's what's pretty much being done there. But you could, look at some parts of the paintings and see a few abstract qualities to them. Okay. Oh. All right. So after school, I still was doing figurative, but I was looking for work and trying to figure out how I was going to survive. So my paintings got way smaller. The paintings that I just showed, those interior paintings, that last one was 4x6. The one before that was 5x6. And so this painting is much smaller. It's still an interior. I wanted to be looser with my paintings. And so I was getting some of that in. I did a series of silkscreen monoprints at an organization called Self-Help Graphics here in LA. It's a great program, and we worked with a master printer, and we got to do sort of a series of these silkscreen monoprints. So silkscreen monoprints, if you're not familiar with that, is you just sort of paint directly on a silk screen. And so you kind of have to do it quickly, because if you don't, then the paint will dry. So they're really fast paintings that are have the ink, the silkscreen ink as the media. And this is kind of, I would consider, one of the last paintings of that figurative time, where I am still painting African-American women, mostly, and still getting some kind of textile in there. But you start seeing these abstract and large movements that are just energized a bit, and you will see many of these aspects of the painting in the abstract work. This piece is at Laban. In my 30s, I started doing public art. I was living in Long Beach at the time, and I heard that there was a station, a train station, MTA, being built like a block and a half away from me. So I decided I'm the closest artist that lives next to this station, and this station should be mine. So I've never done public art, I've never done anything, like never really wrote for a grant, We didn't really learn about that in school. And so I just learned. I just went to the library and got a book and got a video and read the book a couple times and looked at the video a couple times. And one of the things that I learned, from that quick course in how to write a grant was always have, if people don't know you, then have people around you that have the reputation. And so with that said, I thought, okay, I need to find, and we had to find our own fabricators. So I said, I need to find sort of the best fabricators out here to even be seen. So I called these people, just cold calls, and asked them if they would work with me. And I got lucky because they said yes. So I worked with a fabricator by the name of Peter Carlson, who has worked with Ellsworth Kelly and a bunch of other artists that has done the fabrication for them. I worked with a mosaicist that specializes in Venetian glass mosaic. Now, I had chosen quite a few medium as possibility. I did, what's it called? A different kind of tile painting, like a ceramic tile painting. And I had gone to Mexico City that year, and I had seen some Venetian glass mosaics at the University of Mexico City. Now, I had been to Mexico before when I was a child, and had gone back, just sort of maybe in 91 or 1990. And we were in Mexico City, and a taxi driver came up to us and offered us to give us a tour of the University of Mexico. So it's kind of like, well, who is this guy and why? Yeah. But I asked him, I said, well, if you know where the art is and you can talk to us about the art, then yes. And then he said he could. So we took the chance, and he followed through, and he showed us things that aren't in the history books. Like the things that are in the history books are the Orozco, the Siqueiros murals that are at the University of Mexico. But I saw these other murals that inspired this panel right here, which is at the University of Mexico. This one right here. And so this piece is by Jose Chavez Morado, and he did quite a few murals there, and they were in Venetian glass mosaic, and I really love them, and I wanted to do something like this. So it was great to get that that commission, and to be able to work with somebody as knowledgeable and with so much talent as Monica Sharp, who did the fabrication of the Venetian glass mosaic. I had done paintings, and then she interpreted the paintings and made these mosaics like very painterly. And these are them. But I asked her if she would teach me how to do the Venetian glass as well. And so I did this one right here. And so the thing is that it took me a year to do this one. And in a year, she did the rest of the 11 panels. So this public art does have 11 panels, 12 panels altogether. So a couple years later, that's when I went on my first residency, sort of after school. And at that time, I went to Dorland, which is in Temecula. And then I went to Helene Wurlitzer Foundation, which is in New Mexico. So I was in Dorland for a month, and then in New Mexico for about 3 months. And, I was traveling, and I just decided, it almost just, how sometimes you just decide things and you just decide it's like a thought. So it wasn't like all of this planning, I'm going to be abstract now, but I just thought, you know what, I'm going to do some abstract drawings with some charcoal. That's what I want to work on. And so that's what I did. And of course, they're easy to travel with. You're just sort of living out your car for a few months when one does the residencies, at least I was. And so I created these there, and I did want to remove the figuration. I did want to remove color and just paint or just draw form that was inspired by just ideas that I had at the time, and energy and emotion as well. I've always tried to figure out how to incorporate that with the figurative, but the figures started being sort of limiting. So I felt way freer to do these works. So I have a few of these that are from that series. The first two were done at Dorland, and these 3 were done at the Wurlitzer Foundation. So these are a little bit larger. Those first ones were about 19 by 25, and these might be 32 by 48 or something like that. I continued to do public art, and this is at Algin Sutton Rec Center in Los Angeles. And so I fabricated this on my own. So I did learn from Monica and was able to do this, though I did use the person that installed the work, you know, who is an amazing craftsperson. Okay. Those were inspired by an African folk tale called Why the Sun and the Moon Live in the Sky. I did want to draw as well, just sort of practice and get better at my drawing. And so I did these, you know, kind of just a little bit after the abstraction. So I was really sort of going back and forth between abstraction and figuration mostly with the public art. This is another public art piece that is in LA at the LA Child Guidance Center, and self-fabricated again. And it took about a year to do. It's about 30 feet long. Venetian glass mosaic, it takes a long time. It's very labor intensive. And nowadays, when you see a installation for public art that is with glass mosaic, most of the time it's fabricated in big studios that are either in Italy or in Mexico or sometimes in Canada. So artists kind of aren't doing it themselves so much, you know, in the public art arena anymore. But I would like to think that this young man's afro is the first Venetian glass mosaic afro. I don't know if that's true. And this is what the Venetian glass mosaic looks like on the back. So you see a lot of texture that you don't see on the front of the mosaics once it's installed. So I kind of like the back better. And there's a few more details of that same installation. And so I decided that I wanted to focus on abstracts again. And in the very beginning, I was motivated by sort of spiritual meditation and contemplation and that kind of thing. And so the very first works I was doing were sort of single circles that were monochromatic or based on analogous color. And I really wanted them to have this spiritual power or whatever. And I don't know how you can plan that. And I don't think it worked in those, but I was thinking that sort of that analogous color would be interesting to work with in connecting, in that kind of connection. But then I wanted to do more complicated compositions and also start working with space again and start doing these overlapping circles. And I enjoyed sort of doing something a little bit different in the areas where the circles overlap. And you'll see that the colors, sort of an integration of both colors of the circle and then a little bit more. And so that shape becomes sort of more and more pronounced sort of in works as I get more present. So I still was doing sort of a single circle thing, but here's a few multiples. This piece right here is in a group show that I'm gonna be in that is curated by Essence Hardin at the El Segundo Museum of Art, this one on the left. So here are just some more from that series. And these were done in the early 2010s, so 2011, 2012, 2013, etc. This one's in 2014. And this one is a 2017, and this one was done, and it's large. It's about 6 feet tall and 10 feet wide or something like that. And this was done at the residency at Paducah, Kentucky. So a friend of mine had done this residency before. It's actually owned by a very important artist and curator by the name of Alonzo Davis. Alonzo Davis is from LA, and he ran the Brotman Gallery with his brother Del Davis in the 70s. He lives on the East Coast now, sort of in the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area, but he purchased this property in Paducah, and he offers the studio for residencies. So it's a really good one, and I think you should write that down because it's a great studio actually. So you get sort of a living space and this big beautiful studio in the back, and you'll have time to do your work. And so at that time, I decided all the paintings before this point are done in oil, but I decided to paint in acrylic. I decided to move to painting in acrylic because I was only going to be in Paducah for a month. And so if I painted in oil paint, then, I could paint for a week and then blow on the painting for 3 weeks, right? So with the acrylic, the acrylic overnight, it's dried. And so I was using the circles, but I started adding sort of a more direct symbolism to them. And, sort of the idea of going to Paducah, Kentucky is a whole thing, right? So I applied to go to Paducah in 2015, so Barack Obama had been in office, and my friend had gone to this place, and I didn't think anything about it, but then in 2017 or 2016, we got a new president, and people were being very open with their hatefulness, and going to Paducah, Kentucky ended up being a whole nother idea, and intimidating. So I didn't really know what to expect. And so I had always been fascinated with the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction in particular. And so where Paducah is, it's just like a mile away from the river, but the Ohio River, which is part of the Mason-Dixon line. So it's interesting. In fact, somebody joked with me. They said, well, June, if you have a hard time in Paducah, just swim across the river into Ohio and you'll be okay. You'll be on the other side of the South. But I was interested sort of in the history of Reconstruction and slavery in that area. So I just started delving into that history. And then I learned that Margaret Garner, who was a enslaved woman, lived close to Paducah, maybe about an hour away from where I was in Paducah. And so her story is the story that's focused on in the Toni Morrison book, Beloved. And so Toni Morrison sort of based that story off of Margaret Gardner. Now, Margaret Gardner's story is that she was on this plantation and she pretty much had enough. She was probably having bad experiences there with the slave owner, and she was ready to go. She says the next time this river freezes over, the next time the Ohio River freezes, which happens in January, she says, I'm walking across, there's a safe house in Ohio. I'm going to go there. I'm taking all 4 of my children. And she was married and she saw her husband once a week. She said this to her husband, and he said he would go with her. And so she did that. But because of fugitive slave law, she was only in this slave house for a couple hours, this safe house for a couple hours before her enslaver came to bring her back home. And so at some point before she went back, she took one of her children and she killed one of her own children. That's a true story. And that's part of the story of that you would find in the Toni Morrison book, Beloved. So it's an amazing story, and it energized the anti-slavery laws that used her story, and so slavery ended a few years later. But this painting is dedicated to her. It's called For Margaret, the Story of the Ohio. And so that's what that painting is. I got the grant, after I got back from Paducah, a few months later, I found out I got the grant with COLA, the City of Los Angeles Artist Fellowship. And so it came with money. And, I told one of my friends, it's like, wow, I wish I had a studio like this. At that point I was painting out of one of my bedrooms. But I got this grant, it came with $10,000. And I was like, okay, I can get a studio now. So I got a studio that's close by. I'm in San Pedro. So I'm at Angels Gate Cultural Center. So I have a pretty good studio there. And so I was able to paint larger. So this is a large work. This is about 7 feet by 11 feet. And in Paducah, another thing I did, I started another painting. I don't know if I included a slide of it. I probably did. That is just sort of this intersection of the two circles, right? So this ovoid shape right here, this ovoid shape, I learned actually when I was in Paducah, architect friend came and visited me there, and he says, oh, you're drawing the Vesica Piscis. I was like, well, what's that? And he said it's the intersection of the two circles, and in sacred geometry, that intersection is sacred. And it's the place where it's said that transitions from the physical world to the spiritual world happen and vice versa. So it's shaped like a lot of things where that kind of transition happens, including the vulva of a woman. And so I was really fascinated with that and wanted to sort of emphasize that shape in these works. So this piece is called Ufufuo, which is Swahili for mother. It's actually, I'm sorry, for resurrection. The other one is mother. But resurrection, sort of talking about that transition from one plane to the other plane. And these are details of that painting. Now, this one is called Unina. And so it's very obvious that this is a boba, and it's just that shape, and it's focusing on that shape. So I started this painting in Paducah, and I looked really different. But when I got back from Paducah, I was going to apply to be in this exhibition called Skin. And I thought about entering, and I painted a painting. I didn't finish it in time, but in relation to Skin, I thought, okay, in Black vernacular, we might refer to each other, our skin tones, using primary colors. So if somebody's very light skinned, we might refer to them as yellow. If somebody's really, really dark, we might refer to them as blue-black. If somebody's sort of in between and looks like they have a little bit of Indian in them, We might refer to them as red or red bone. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought that was interesting that that occurred with, that had already been sort of in place, sort of describing these Black skin tones and primary colors. All colors come from primary colors, and Africa being sort of the seed of humanity, you know, all life coming from Africa. I thought that parallel was super interesting. So I started using these primary colors in the works, you know, with browns, but primary colors. And then I had a dream. And I had a dream about these Black flags that were just sort of draped, and how I knew they were flags, I don't know, because they were Black, but there were 4 of them, and I just sort of remember that super clearly. And so I just kind of sat on the idea of the dream for a while, and then I thought, well, maybe I should paint them, and it's so different than what I do. And so I painted this painting here with just lines. It was something I was interested in doing, and it has the primary colors and the browns and colors I was interested in exploring. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go on and do this flag. And so I did, and I really did want to do sort of this drape installation, but I'd never done anything like that before. And I said, well, let me do something that feels a little bit more familiar to what I have done before. And that is how I made the decision to make the flag like this. So the first flags were on unstretched canvas and mounted on canvas. And here are some other paintings where I am just emphasizing sort of that vesica piscis and the intersection of the circle. And these are all being painted around the same time, okay? All being painted around the same time. So like I was saying, the flags were done on unstretched canvas, but on the right side, you'll see that it is mounted on stretched linen. This is a show that, my first show with Luis de Jesus, and here's some installation shots. And I finally did figure out how I wanted to do the drape flags. So I did do them, and they look similar to this in my dream. And so what I ended up doing was getting some real thin canvas, you know, like some 7-ounce canvas, unprimed, and I painted the flag with still the same kind of palette, but darker, and then spray painted the back with black. You know, it looks really like rubber, but that's how that occurred. Here's a couple more recent flags. You know, I took these to New York. These are like 2020. And this flag was done last year during COVID. And I just wanted to paint a painting that didn't have any color. So this is kind of a white painting to me, but just sort of removed of color. And that X in the middle is representative of the X of a Confederate flag. But I didn't want it to be obviously a Confederate flag. So I just wanted it to be sort of the color removed, and the imagery just sort of faded. And I wanted it to look really sweet, you know, like confection. And so that just sort of represented sort of a silence and an innocence concerning Black lives and the violence that occurs to Black bodies, and sort of a lack of acknowledging and of that entity, which, you know, sort of has evolved a little bit, you know, since Black Lives Matter demonstrations, the brave people that were in the streets fighting for our rights to safety. Okay. And so these are more related to my recent works. And this piece right here is at the LMU show, the Laban show as well. And so at the beginning of 2020, the end of 2019, I went out for a public art commission that happened to be in Beverly Hills. And so it's kind of customary to do research on the history of a place. So I just started doing some research of the history. I'm always interested in how Black people have interacted with a place, you know, so Beverly Hills, I don't know anything about that. And if Black people ever did interact in a large number there. And so what I discovered was the first inhabitant was an Afro-Latino woman, all right? And she was the granddaughter of one of the original pobladores from the LA Pueblo, and her name was Maria Rita Quinteros Valdez de Villa. And so she was gifted that land. Her husband was in the military and he died. I'm not clear on how he died, but she inherited that property. And it was a thriving rancho for a number of years. And eventually the rancho got taken away from her. And so, so it sort of speaks to this sort of cycle of sort of the history of Black life to me in America, where there's sort of this trauma and this loss and this theft that occurs, and then this hope that that people have, you know, even in the midst of this trauma, and then that hope sort of energizing sort of a new life or new possibilities through many times through migration. And so I started thinking about other stories that could have happened sort of locally that are like that. Like, what is this history that nobody knows about that sort of is underneath the surface here? And okay, so this is Beverly Hills. I'm sorry, this is not Beverly Hills. This is sort of dedicated to Biddy Mason. And so Biddy Mason may be a name that you're familiar with. Biddy Mason was also an enslaved woman who came out to Los Angeles with the slave owner. And but LA, you were free. All right. So at one point, you know, enslaved people got freedom. And so the slave owner wanted to move back to Arkansas or wherever, I don't remember. And so Biddy Mason was like, I'm not going with you. And so they went to court, and Biddy Mason won her freedom, and she ended up being an entrepreneur, a landowner, a philanthropist, and a very important contributor to the history of Los Angeles. So some of her property was located on Spring Street in between 3rd and 4th. So this one is dedicated to her. And this one is dedicated to Maria Martinez. And so there is a photo that has Maria Martinez. It's a really beautiful painting of a photo. And this is the fabric that she was wearing in that photo. So I included that in this painting. I'm just sort of including everything. This is a street that she lived on. This street is where her rancho was. It's Alpine Drive and Sunset. So here's Alpine, but I don't think I drew the line. So this is a map there. This is some more map of Beverly Hills, but it's colored in the colors of the redlining map, so this is the red line map that's sort of on top of the history of Maria Martinez being in this place. And these are the actual colors that was used in these red line maps of the 1940s. So you may know that these redlining maps existed to sort of designate neighborhoods as being desirable or undesirable. Of course, where people of color were, Black people, Latinx was considered red area and undesirable. Yellow was just above that, right? So maybe transitioning down. Blue was transitioning up, and green was the most desirable areas. So this is actually a piece of the red line map in Beverly Hills from 1940. And there's a small piece of red in Beverly Hills, and that is where the servants of these inhabitants live in that small little area. And that's in La Jolla. And so I was contacted by Linda Forsha about possibly doing a mural there. And so I was sort of on this track of sort of figuring out what the history is underneath, the buildings, and I learned about one of the first Black occupants in La Jolla by the name of Henrietta Van Horn DuBose. And she was married to Thomas DuBose, who was the first Black inhabitant of La Jolla that moved to La Jolla in 1904. Now, La Jolla was always designated to be a very desirable neighborhood, but that neighborhood too needed servants, to keep them coming. So Black people from around the country saw La Jolla as a place that they could get work. And so there was a migration, or part of that migration. There's a great migration of African Americans that Isabel Wilkerson speaks of in her book, Warmth of Other Suns, that took place from the 20s to the 50s. The bulk of it happened at that time. So I found out about these inhabitants, and Henrietta acquired a lot of property. She inherited some property from her husband and acquired some more property. And right on the street of Girard, where this piece is, but on Draper as well. So you see these lines here. Now I'm enlarging sort of the lines of the streets, and I'm incorporating what I consider to be this sacred Vesica pieces shape to talk about sort of the power of women's determination, if you will. It's like you've got that shape that is a portal to the non-physical world, and the woman holds that portal. So that's where the shapes come from. And so you still see some browns there. And this was actually inspired by, I painted this painting first because I was interested still in using a dark palette, but I did change many of the colors for the La Jolla project. Okay, so this painting is in the exhibition at Luis de Jesus. That's up now for another week, and so are these. And this piece, the name of this is Amanecer Sunset. And if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that's a Spanish word that means sunrise and sunset. And so here you just see a few lines that are being covered, but this little line right here is sunset. It sort of continues with this Vesica pieces that I include there. And this is a piece of Alpine Drive, which is the street that is on top of the land where Maria's rancho was. Okay, and so this is another one that is dedicated to Maria Rita. And this one, it's titled Alpina de las Aguas. Her rancho was called Rancho de las Aguas. That land was super fertile back then. And this is around 1840 that I think that she moved into that space around then. Don't quote me. But it was very fertile land. There's hills, those Beverly Hills had streams that were coming down. La Cienega actually was a stream that was coming down. So the land was irrigated and fertile. But there were droughts as well. This painting is there. This one is called Only a Gardener. So this is the only one that doesn't have that Vesica pieces shape, but this is dedicated to another La Jolla resident who is Edgar Coleman, whose house was a historical site. It was removed later. And they didn't want to make his house a historical site because he was only a gardener. So what? He was Black and had property here. So I titled this piece Only a Gardener. And so you still see the Girard line for Girard Street and Draper. Okay. Here's another one. And it's just, you just see this movement, and it sort of represents sort of the evolution of moving on and the strength of African American women and the hope, even through the trauma that we have, and sort of this strength to move on. And is there anything else? Okay, I think that's the last one. I think I'm all done. So if you have any questions or comments.
June, I'm not sure if I'm on the screen. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I don't see myself, but we,
I'm gonna stop share.
oh, all right. That helps me actually. But I think we'd like to see the images. I can tell you there's just about 300 people where the crowd is going wild. That was really fantastic. Thank you for all of that. Very good presentation. And there are some questions that I'm going to relay rather than have all the folks jumping in. And so I'm actually going to take you a little bit out of sequence, because one of the first questions that came in was when you were talking about your residencies, and I think it was the Paducah residency. I'm not totally sure. And the question from Tiger Lily Maynard is pretty straight ahead. It just says, what was the residency like? So, I mean, maybe if there's anything you want to add about the differences between the various residencies that you've had. I mean, you talked about that experience of being in Kentucky during a time of hate, but I mean, I don't know if you want to compare that to an experience you would have had here in Temecula, or even to think about the type of residency type experience you would have had in Skowhegan, which was, very much an art.
They were all very different. Paducah ended up being like super interesting. It wasn't that bad because Paducah, at least the majority of people, sort of this pocket of Democrat run, it's like a Democrat run area. The mayor is Democratic, but you always know when you're in an environment that you're not welcome. It's a spirit, and you know it when you walk into it, or you know it when you feel it. So I would walk around Paducah and go into some places. It's like, nah, I'm not coming back here. I happened to be there in February. It was cold. They had a blizzard where the sirens went off that I've never heard before in my life, sirens because of a blizzard. It was super scary, blackout and that kind of thing. But I really, I'm from LA. I didn't mind the cold. In fact, it kept me in the studio even more. And so I was just able to get some long hours in the studio. It was just amazing. It was a great studio, and I was able to do long hours. But on the weekends, I would do little field trips. And one of the field trips I took was to Memphis. I was dying to go to Memphis, and I knew I would love it, and I did. But the drive from Paducah to Memphis, it's not like a 405 freeway that you could get on. There's no 5. So there's just these little highways that have intersections and street, so it's small and open. There's no walls that cut off sound or anything like that. So we were driving through Tennessee or Kentucky, and there were flag. There was a big Confederate flag, sort of on the top of a hill. I mean, my sister lives in the South, so she told me about the Confederate flags on trucks, but this is like a big giant flag that's sort of as big as my wall over there, that was on top of a hill. And that was just super jarring, and I feel like that had something to do with sort of my dream of flags that occurred like 6 months later.
Yeah, that's troubling to hear. Let me see. There's so many questions in here that are about media. Let me see if I can kind of combine a couple of them, because somebody's asking just how do you shift from media? And I mean, I'm mindful that you spent quite a bit of time showing us how you translate your paintings to the glass mosaic. And then you've also talked about shifting from oil to latex for expediency, right? So you could make more work. So somebody's asking how you shift mediums, but then somebody else is saying, I really want you to work with fabric. This woman is saying, she's saying, I'm a clothing designer and I want to see you working with fabric. And then somebody else asks about architecture. And maybe these questions come about too, not just because of their own interest and practice, but seeing your early works that showed interior spaces and use the windows and the walls to block, and you pointed out your use of fabrics in multiple pieces. So have you ever wanted to move away from painting and use those actual media?
I've never wanted to move away from painting, but I think it would be fun to fabric design. I've heard people sort of suggest that a lot of times, but I would love to, if the opportunity presented itself, and how it would depend on how that opportunity presented itself. But somebody asked about switching media, and I have a feeling that I can answer sort of a question that's being asked, which is sort of switching from oil paint to acrylic paint, because I was using the oil paint pretty thick. And the acrylic paint, I wanted the acrylic paint to do what the oil paint was doing. So I experimented with a lot of different mediums and gels, and then sort of landed on a specific gel, from Nova Color that's very thick. And I mixed that into the paint. And so that sort of gives me the viscosity that I'm looking for in the paint.
You talk about the viscosity. There's also a question from Eugene Tran saying, when you're asking about the colors. And so he's saying, when you talk about the works that is referring to the overlapping circles, were the colors you selected intended to portray issues of color theory? Are they related to that at all?
I would say in the beginning, I was just using, I'm very interested in color. I'm interested in color theory. I'm interested in all kinds of color relationships. And that's basic. I am doing experimentations concerning that, but I'm not thinking, I'm going to use this particular triad. I'm not doing that.
It's interesting. I think you began the talk talking about the exhibition you saw, on Black art at LACMA, and you mentioned Alma Thomas. I mean, that was like the first, and sort of the first breath of your talk. And then the subsequent artists that you mentioned were all representational artists. Of course, Alma Thomas, very late. I mean, she's worked in many styles, but gained the most attention late in life when she made her shift to abstract works, which have a sort of a petal-like radiating imagery. So maybe can you talk about, and you made a similar shift, moving from representing, the Black figure in space, moving toward abstraction. So can you talk about?
Yeah, I mentioned her on purpose to say that her work had been in my psyche like all that time, and then sort of 20 years later, 30 years later, I'm starting to do this thing. So I had been a long time an early admirer of her work, and so she's definitely an influence of mine.
I know when we did our exhibition with Jack Whitten, he talked about, who's was a terrific abstract painter, talked about the challenges of being a Black artist painting in an abstract style, and that there was pressure to represent his community in a figurative way. Yet he opted to lean in towards the sort of towards abstraction, but with its metaphorical potential, as I think you do. How easily do you feel pressure to represent your community or to tell stories through?
That pressure has existed for, since the Harlem Renaissance, right? And And so that pressure is really real. And you know, to be honest with you, the paintings that I was doing in San Diego, I was hearing things in my ear that they were too European, you know, even back then, you know, so there was always something coming from somewhere that had that pressure. It's something, it's just something that we do, you know. And the abstracts, I would say, when I was doing those black and white abstracts, that was like in 1997, that kind of pressure still was in existence, you know. So, but people still paint, you know, artists are artists and they're going to paint what they paint.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, also, I don't, you didn't talk about this, but I feel like I've heard you say before, when the image of working with the flag, you did some works that were draped flags, that were more sculptural, and that you felt almost funny about doing that, to say that's maybe that's something Sam Gilliam does, you know, who would work with the unstretched canvas, but that you then, you know, kind of found your way back to kind of having it both ways, you know, doing a flag, but that it was painted.
Mhm.
I guess maybe I'm just commenting on sort of the burden of art history and those legacies, you know, when there are influences and when you want to identify them, or when you might want to pull away.
Right. Very true. I did mention that.
Your more recent abstract work, though, I mean, as you pointed out in the last body of work you showed, comes out of research, you know, specific histories. And so there's a question in here just asking, you know, how you start your research, you know, sort of, are you going in, you know, looking for a certain issue? Have you, is it serendipitous? Maybe if you can just talk about your process of inspiration and research.
Yeah, you know, so as I was mentioning before, uh, sort of looking into that specific history came from looking at the history, looking through the history of Beverly Hills. And what I was looking for, I was just looking for sort of Black presence in Beverly Hills, and how it was and who it was, and what interactions were in Beverly Hills. And then I found this woman who was a pioneer and the first resident of Beverly Hills. So I hadn't even considered that as a possibility, you know, that there could be a Afro-Latina that owned property in the 18, you know, I mean, I hadn't considered it, even though this was Mexico, and why wouldn't it? So now we know the story. So I knew about Biddy Mason already. And then when the La Jolla job came up, you know, I just said, oh, I wonder, you know, who are the first Black folks there? And so there's like these great articles. There was this great series of articles that was written in the La Jolla Light, that talked about, you know, the history of these first residents. And it's an excellent series. And
the Edgar Coleman painting, one of the last works you showed, is that on view at Luis de Jesus?
yes, it is.
It is. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Just one more question. I'm sorry, and maybe you've answered this, but you had mentioned in your talk about, you talked about migration, you know, and that kind of the resiliency, and your exhibition at Luis de Jesus is called the Joy of Other Sons. Can you maybe just expand a little bit on the references in that exhibition?
Yeah, well, the title is is just sort of a take on the Isabel Wilkerson book that I had just mentioned, which is called The Joy of Other Suns. And it's one of my favorite books of all time. I think she's such a great writer because she's writing about history, but telling the story of these lives that read like a novel, sort of at the same time. That's what I really love about her. And so she sort of chose three people that were living that did sort of a particular leg of the migrations that came out of the South, sort of these typical migrations that came out of the South. So one of the figures migrated from Florida to New York, another one from Mississippi to Chicago, and then another from Louisiana to LA. And so I was just using that title to sort of talk about just sort of that moment or that period of optimism that survivors have to have, you know?
That might be a nice segue to what could be our last question that we have coming in from one of the students, asking, this is a more personal level, but asking if there was ever a time when you doubted yourself and your abilities, and if so, how did you bounce back? I mean, and we ask you that as you're, being celebrated with these many exhibitions.
That's a great question.
For the emerging artists, the aspiring artists in our schools.
Yeah, so in undergrad at San Diego State, I was super fortunate to have very supportive teachers. Joy Shipman, Pat Colley, Gail Roberts was one of my instructors as well. Super, super supportive. And they actually sort of went to bat for me like Joy Shipman did. And I got a full scholarship to Skowhegan because of that. So in the very beginning, I had sort of this foundation to give me some confidence. And so then you're sort of out of school and you got to pay all your student loans and you have to get a job and you have to do that. You don't have the time to sort of really dedicate in the studio. And it's sort of at that time where my confidence had waned, but I felt like I just, just in retrospect, I had enough confidence to just sort of carry me through. And then the public art occurred. And I was 30 years old when I got that. And so I knew, I was kind of young to get this public art. At the time, like nowadays, young people do get way more opportunities than young people got when I was young. So, that gave me confidence, so these things would occur, to just be enough to sort of keep me going. But then finally, and I would say, maybe about 15 years ago when I started maybe the Energy Burst series, finally I decided that it's like, you know what, you've been very external, about sort of having this confidence. And, you just can sort of declare that this is what you're going to do and not bend. And so it's been like that ever since.
Oh, I love that. Because the last question that just came in, really, you've already answered, because the question is, at what point did you realize you could make a serious career out of being an artist? What risk did you take to make it happen?
It's going to be easier for you guys, but there were not opportunities when I got out of school. They weren't hiring Black folks, to teach in the universities. They weren't paying us any mind when we came through the doors of their galleries. And so that has been very hard and very painful. And so I sort of made that sort of decision that I was just going to sort of have this confidence, whether I'm delusional or not. I'm just going to sort of, nobody has to know what I'm thinking in my mind, right? And so I was sort of having that attitude about that. And things started happening after that decision was made. I remember I said at one point, you know what, if somebody calls me and says they want to have a one-person show, I'm going to be ready for them. I just kind of said that and then, got to work. And then someone called me really out of the blue because somebody backed out of a show. And I had this show that I said I was going to be ready for a year before. So, things like that occurred, so it's like I said, I was in Paducah. I called my girlfriend. I said, oh, I need a wall like this when I get home. I need a studio like this.
So much space, you mean? You had so much space.
Yeah. So I think that when your energy is sort of believing and you've got the work to sort of back it up, then you're okay.
Well, in following that residency, you got the space, right? You got the space in San Pedro. Is that right?
Right. Because of that grant, I wouldn't have been able to afford that space without that grant.
Mm-hmm. I just sort of, you also start talking about grant writing and teaching yourself, it's not enough to teach yourself to be an artist, right? But then now you got to learn how to write a grant and how to find a fabricator and, work across media and all of that. So there is a lesson in here about resiliency, but we are the beneficiaries of it to be able to see so much of your work, if only in reproductions tonight. But we will get up to Loyola Marymount to see more pieces in person. And I want to, on behalf of UCSD and the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, thank you, June, for this very generous presentation and for your candor.
You're welcome, and it's been my honor and pleasure. Thank you.